anything else, it's like I just feel not worthy of anyone's attention, anyone's love, any accolades, just anything.
I can't tell you that I'm any different. I don't know. I mean, I do know where it comes from. It all stems from your relationship with your parents and how you were raised.
It stems from your relation with your parents. It stems from, you went through this, you and I have this in common. Like, you went to a black school, I went to a white school. And you have this childhood trauma that you haven't dealt with. And you think you've dealt with it because you're on the radio and you talk about it and you made a lot of money. And I think I've dealt with it because I can write jokes about it, but I never dealt with it. That was just a horrible existence. The closest character I can relate to is Tim Robbins in The Shawshank. Every day was hell. I was a nigga and I got fucking my ass beat and I got physically fucked up and sometimes some sexual shit happened. And yeah, like, I wasn't raped, but rape-ish.
Don't you remember the name of every kid who beat the shit out of you?
I was doing a movie a couple years ago, and one of my bullies was working security on the movie.
Shit.
A guy who literally one day in school turned me upside down and shook the money out of my pockets. And I'm filming a scene. This is a top 5. And I look and I'm like, is that B? I'll just say B. And he nodded, kind of shame, he was kind of ashamed. And I just gave him just a quick look like, hey man, I hope you're doing well. You take care. And I kept it moving. I didn't like, get him off the set, get him fired. It's like, his sin has punished him. He could have been my friend.
Right.
You know what I mean? He could have been in the trailer with us watching The Godfather. You know what I mean?
Mic check. Here we go. What's up, y'all? This is MCM, and you're listening to You're Probably Right podcast. And I'm just gonna talk about something here, but just remember, you're welcome at my house anytime. I also wanted to say that, just to let you know, that my podcast is listener discretion. Listener discretion is advised. It is for public consumption, but it is for entertainment purposes only. These are some of these things that I say out of my mouth are my own thoughts, and they are not a representation of anyone or any company or any institution. Of course, when I do read a couple articles here, it will be reading the writer's thoughts, and I just want to give you some thought about it. I'm going to have a little conversation about it, of course, but at the same time, I just want you to think clearly, openly, with your own mind and not the mind of others. Okay? So, here we go, without further ado. So I got 2 topics for you today. You heard Chris Rock talking about his disability, his learning disability, and talked about his times as a youngster. And I'm going to reflect on that a little bit for myself. And then I'm going to talk about social justice, anti-racism, and stuff like that. But usually I've been just giving my 2 cents. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what Thomas Sowell has to say, and a little bit of what John McWhorter has to say, and then we'll hear about what John MacArthur has to say, and maybe I'll have some, I guess, a couple cents of what I think. At the same time, my Canada Dry is finished. Okay, here we go. So let me get right to it. So, because sometimes these things need to be defined, because a lot of the time The writers and the speakers in these times tend to think that everybody knows what everybody's talking about, and all the ideas are commonplace or they are common knowledge. So let me just give you a few definitions. Race, and this is by Omi and Wynette, 1994, page 54, and it says race is a social construct and a concept which signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies. Simple. Racism. Racism is belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Again, Omi and Wynette, 54 again. Racism is a system. It is not an individual character flaw, nor a personal moral failing, nor a psychiatric illness. It is a system, consisting of structures, policies, practices, and norms that structures opportunity and assigns value based on phenotypes, or that the way people look. It is unfairly disadvantaged some individuals and communities. Yet, even more profoundly, the system of racism undermines realization of the full potential of our whole society because of the waste of human resources. Okay? That source was Center for the Study of Racism, Social Justice, and Health. Let's see, what is racial equity? Racial equity is the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted in a statistical sense, like the way I try to say it really quickly, how one fares. When we use the term, we are thinking about racial equity as one part of racial justice, and thus we also include work to address root causes of inequities, not just their manifestation. This includes elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes by race, or that failing to eliminate them. Okay. Actually, I was going to talk about Chris Rock first, and I dove right into this. Let me go back. But anyway, you have the definitions there. I'm going to give you a few more when I come back. But check this out. You see, I went through all kinds of stuff, kind of like Chris Rock alluded to. He didn't really get into the whole story. And, it really brought back some memories for me, thinking of what I went through as a youngster. I was bullied, but in a different way. Sorry, drank too much Canada Dry. Okay, and my learning disability is something called dysgraphia. And I want to give you a proper definition. Let's see if I can find a proper definition. Okay, well, it says, as at a glance, dysgraphia refers to a challenge with writing. It impacts skills like handwriting, typing, spelling. There are many ways people with dysgraphia can improve their writing skills. Anyhow, dysgraphia is a term that refers to trouble with writing. Many experts view dysgraphia as challenges with a set of skills known as transcription. These skills, handwriting, typing, and spelling, allow us to produce writing. Trouble expressing your thoughts in writing isn't formally recognized as a part of dysgraphia. That's a learning disability known as written expression disorder. But when people struggle with transcription, it can get in the way of thinking about ideas and how to convey them. For example, people with dysgraphia may write more slowly than others. That can affect how well they express themselves in writing, like say on a test. Plus, they tend to have trouble with spelling because it's hard for them to form letters when they write. Not only when you write, I'm just throwing my 2 cents in here, because sometimes people try to spell to me. I've said this in a prior podcast episode, where somebody tried to spell the word, even if you said you want to spell the word mud to me, and you didn't say the word mud, you just said somebody threw MUD. I literally have to mentally put those letters beside each other, almost like if I was on a show and I literally put them in the air to see what it spelled. My brain detects, like dysgraphia explains, it's very difficult sometimes. It's like the letters are out there or the numbers are out there, and if you're trying to think, it's just everything gets jumbled up. Lastly, they say dysgraphia isn't a matter of intelligence. The challenges are often caused by trouble with motor skills. Those skills can improve with help, and people with dysgraphia may also be eligible to use accommodations at work or school. Now, what I can say is accommodations like speech to text, like on a computer or those kinds of things, help me a lot when I take the time to write. But where it doesn't help you is, like, say you're in a chat for work or school and you have to just use the chat box. It gets me all the time. I'm sure there's other people who understand what I'm talking about, because you don't have a lot of time to respond in many cases. You just have to get the words out and get them down, typed into the little box. But the problem with me is I'll type them out. I'll think I'm typing the most elaborate, intelligent response to whatever the question is or whatever it is, and I'll hit enter. Boom, it's gone. Then, because it's not mine anymore, it's like it releases into the World Wide Web, and then I'll read it, and it's like I'm not reading it as I wrote it. Now I'm just reading it like anybody else would read it, and that's when I'll see like the 10 mistakes in a paragraph, and I'll be just, it's like a whole cringe. It's like your whole body's like, what are you doing? And you feel like an idiot. It's not like you didn't have the ideas. It's not like you didn't know what you were saying, but for whatever reason, the way our brains work, people who live with dysgraphia, your brain assumes that your hands were typing the same thing that the brain was thinking, but things don't get plural, punctuation, spelling, all kinds of, like, the spelling generally gets helped by just the helper on the keyboards, right? Of course, they might put the wrong there, or which, or you know what I mean, like those kinds of words. So you can make mistakes at any time, and it's like it's almost guaranteed. If you write longer than 5 words strung together, chances are you type something, and if you have dysgraphia, you made a mistake somewhere, even if you can't see it. And the problem is, as you're typing it and as you're writing it or whatever it is, it's a part of you. So your brain knows what you wanted to say, and sometimes even when you're trying to read over your work, because you haven't released it into the world yet, it's a part of you. So even if I'm reading it over, I literally omit the mistakes that are actually down on the screen or down on paper. it's like I don't even see them because I know what my brain was trying to say. The one thing that I can tell you that helps is time between writing and sending it, delivering it, or mailing it for a person with dysgraphia. So if I write something now and then I have time to say, go eat a meal or go do something totally different, then come back and sit down and look at the writing, that whatever I did, I'll see all the mistakes. It is annoying to see it, trust me, but it's different if I haven't had to send it out to anyone yet. Then like the mistakes can be fixed and everything can, everything can go as it's supposed to go. But back to what Chris was saying, I went through a horrible time as a student and as a young person, and I've spoken at length that the worst times in my life was in grade 4 to 6, and being bullied by kids. I too went to a school that was predominantly white. Most of the classes that I was in, from I'd say kindergarten straight up to grade 6, you're lucky if you have 5 black kids in the class, and everything wouldn't have probably been that bad, except for I was being bullied by the 2 black kids in my class, and we happened to be in the same class for 3 straight years. And of course they had little henchmen, white kids, who would basically do their bidding because they didn't want to get beat up and they wanted to be cool. I mean, it was really crazy back in those days. We had 5 guys who would wear these t-shirts with the cut-off sleeves and the big huge flag, I think it was the British flag, that Def Leppard used to wear. I guess one or 2 or 3 of the bandmates used to possibly wear. I can't remember how it goes with the band because I haven't looked at anything Def Leppard for a long time. But the bottom line is, these guys would pick the day that they would all wear their cutoff. Is it a Union Jack? T-shirt. It was a white T-shirt and it had the English flag on the front of it. I guess some of you probably know what I'm talking about. And those guys, that's what they were called, those guys. It was basically a small little infantile gang, and they used to terrorize the rest of the kids as long as you weren't doing something you were supposed to be doing. Lord help you if you were a nerd, or if you were a dweeb, or if you were from another country and couldn't speak properly, or if you had a learning disability, or if they just didn't like you for amount of reasons. Or as I've spoken again, I was a kid that I started sweating early as a young black kid, so my BO was not always in check, especially after playing athletics. And that's just something that I had to deal with these guys, and they made my life for those 3 years literally living hell. And growing up, as an adult, and I realized, just like Chris was saying, and he was saying that Howard Stern was saying the same thing, but Howard Stern said that he went to an all-black school where Chris went to an all-white school, which I can understand is, with all the stuff that happened back in those days, and I had a lot of the same experiences as Chris did. The only thing is I wasn't physically beaten up. I was mentally tortured. Now, where you're sitting right now and who you're talking to or listening with might, you could probably cut this podcast off and have a discussion of your own. You could probably say, okay, well, what's worse? Getting the living daylights kicked out of you regularly, or being mentally tortured where you can't literally take in any of the lessons and learn anything? There's so many learning gaps in my learning, but I mean, I still lived with fear. I still was given the ultimatums and the threatenings, I'll see you at 3:15, blah, blah, blah. Maybe nothing goes on. Maybe they just push you, or do stuff that like just idiot things to you, bullying you that way. Luckily, or I would say thank God for the fact that I was an average sized kid. I wasn't a little dweeby, skinny kid that could be picked up and thrown all over the place. Anybody who was going to have a fight with me would have to make sure that I was deathly afraid so that I couldn't even properly function in a fight. That'd be the best that they could hope for, because beyond that, I was a physically imposing guy, so that if it became physical, you know that if you hit me, I was going to hit you. Chances are whatever you gave, you were going to get as good, if not worse, than what you gave. So the physical fightings didn't really happen with me. I mean, I had guys who would try to hit me in hockey and different sports and stuff like that, but most of the time when it was tried on me, they got hurt as well. I was a pretty tough kid, but I was a baby of the family. I didn't know what it was to struggle for the last piece of steak in the middle of the table, or I didn't have to fight over the last piece of chicken. It was given to me. It was put on my plate by my mom, and there was nobody who was going to take the food out of my plate or out of my mouth. You know what I mean? And I didn't grow up with that fighting spirit, and it's okay. I was just a different kid. And I feel for those people who were and who had to physically fight regularly, like, say, Chris. But I didn't. But I was tortured. I felt bad about myself most of the years. And this stuff affects me even now. Into my 40s, I'm here talking about it and about to turn 50. And I just remember how much and realize how much this stuff really tortured my life. And I do have the same thing where people will look in, past relationships. People will say, my friends came around, you weren't very nice to them, or you didn't stick around, or people come around and say, you act like you don't like them and you're, standoffish, or you're uptight, or whatever it is. And it's like, no, it's unresolved things in my childhood that helps me to be a jerk sometimes. And yeah, I was confident when playing sports. I'm confident sometimes when I'm singing or speaking of something that I really know a lot about. And it's sometimes maybe arrogance would even come out in certain ways. Or sometimes I realize that people really can't read me, which is something really horrible. And I think that Chris has spoken to as well, is sometimes people really, really have a hard time reading you because you grew up always trying to shelter your feelings and shelter what you really thought, because you didn't want, to get jumped by 4 or 5 people. You didn't want to be ostracized. You just wanted to float under the radar. And unfortunately for many of us, we were unable to float under the radar, or we were not allowed to float under the radar, even if we stayed quiet. As these guys could probably tell you, somebody would still be there to draw attention to you, and it's surprisingly sad. Well, it's not sad. It's not surprisingly sad, but it's just surprising how much, say, 3, 4, 5 years of your life, because I still went through other things in the years subsequently after kindergarten to grade 6. I went to junior high. I went to a different junior high. I spoke about that as well. But I still went through other things because I still ended up at the same high school for 3 years with these same people, and ended up on teams with some of them and in a few classes. It was a different day. I was a bigger kid, and we, had gotten different friends from different schools. So it was a little bit better, but there was still remnants, and it was still affecting me. So I still had issues, and I grew up with those issues. And unfortunately, a lot of those issues followed me into most of my relationships and probably helped me destroy a few relationships because of how damaged I was. And, that's all I'm going to say about that. So, I'm going to get back onto the racial train a little bit. So where was I? So now I had spoken on what racism is as a system and racial equity, and we'll go on to anti-racism. So anti-racism, the opposite of racist, is not racist. Wait, hold on. It sounds, I'm going to read exactly how they put it. Quotations. The opposite of racist is not racist. It's anti-racist. This is spoken by Dr. Ibrahim X. Kendi. Okay, that's what he says. It says, anti-racism is a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to racial equity and are substantiated by anti-racist. And it says racist, one who is supporting a racist policy through the actions or inactions or expressions of racist ideas. Anti-racist, one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions, expressions, and anti-racist ideas. The source, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kendi, 2019. Let's see. That was anti-racism and anti-black racism. Let me just get that and then we'll move right on to some common responses to anti-racism. So it'd be nice if we had the definition. So let's see. This is from the Council for the Democracy. Can we say the word? Oh yeah, that's what it is. The source from the Council for the Democratizing Education. Okay. Anti-blackness are being two-part formation that both strips blackness of value, dehumanizes, and systematically marginalizes black people. This form of anti-blackness is overt racism. Society also associates politically incorrect comments with the overt nature of anti-black racism. Beneath this anti-black racism is the covert, structural, and systemic racism which predetermines the socioeconomic status of blacks in this country and is held in place by anti-black policies, institutions, and ideologies. Anti-blackness is also the disregard for anti-black institutions and policies. This disregard is the product of class, race, and or gender privilege certain individuals experience due to anti-black institutions and policies. Wow. Okay. So I can tell you right now, a lot of people are going to have a hard time with that wording, but it's something that we argue and something that we talk about all the time, these days. And now, let's move on to the response. Or should I? Yeah, let's move on to the response. These are responses of people talking about anti-black racism. Okay, let's see. There is no evidence of racism in STEM. Now, do they? Let's see if we can find it. Is somebody gonna tell me? Do they define it? I think they do. Okay, check it out. The wrongful murders of black individuals during 2020, including George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others, compounded by a long history of similar incidents, inspired protests around the world against racism and police brutality. The growing anti-racism movement sparked conversations within science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine, STEM. Okay, there you go. So now we know what STEM is. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. Okay, so the jobs. We're not there, apparently. Surrounding ways to combat racial bias is our respective fields, a spotlight was placed on discriminatory history of science, research, and medical practices, as well as the problematic modern-day policies that perpetuate the lack of racial diversity and equity in STEM. So that's all I'm going to read about that part, because they have their statement here. Let's see. There is no evidence of racial STEM in racism in STEM. Okay, so let's just hopefully you'll hear something. I just want to answer these, but I want to make sure that I don't just have to read the whole thing, because they get pretty elaborate in their explanations. Let me just read the first paragraph. Hopefully it'll say something. First, it is important to disguise, I can't read. First, it is important to distinguish, imagine that's how I saw it, disguise. I just saw distinguish as disguise just now, between the method of science and the enterprise of science. The scientific method is an objective strategy to understand natural phenomena. The scientific enterprise describes how experiments are conceived, performed, and interpreted in real practice, while the scientific method is impartial. The scientific enterprise is subject to individual bias. Let's see. Yeah, individual biases and societal values. There is a large body of evidence demonstrating that racism, particularly in anti-black racism, is prevalent within the scientific enterprise. Approximately 62% of black employees and 42% of Hispanic employees in the STEM workforce says that they have experienced racial discrimination in recruitment, the hiring process, or competing for promotions. Oh boy, I can tell you about that. Racial discrimination often manifests as microaggressions, commonplace indignities that, whether intentional or unintentional, communicate a hostile and derogatory message by BIPOC. For example, women of color faculty report being frequently mistaken for university staff or graduate students, and black professors are often perceived by their colleagues to have been hired primarily for their underrepresented minority status and feel added pressure to prove their legitimacy as scholars. And that's where I'm going to stop there. So somebody says there is no evidence of it, and some are arguing and saying that's not true. And I can honestly tell you from working in a like-minded industry, I can say that it is difficult, because you do wonder sometimes when you get a job, you wonder, did I get the job because I'm black? When you don't get the job, you wonder, did I not get the job because I'm black? It's something that regularly pops up into most average black people. Now, you might, and I'm sure even people who are overachievers probably feel it as well, but I can't say because I'm not an overachiever, and I don't pretend to try to put my head around it. I mean, where I'm saying that is somebody who always got straight A's, who is black, maybe they're even dark skinned, because there's that whole light skin, dark skin thing that people try not to give much credence to, but we know in the black community that there is. You'll look at somebody like Colin Powell and say, well, yeah, he's black. You can definitely see he's black, but he's lighter than a lot of white people. Or hear people who don't like black people say, back in the days that they liked Prince and Michael Jackson. And again, they're barely black looking in many instances because of the stuff that Michael Jackson did to his skin and just the natural cultural colors that Prince lived with. They were looked at differently. In my days, the first person who was black that was looked upon and respected by most, if not everybody in society, would have been probably Michael Jordan. And he became a huge hero for black kids because he was black. He was dark. He was called the Black Cat, for goodness sakes. He was dark, but he was tall and physically fit and good looking, but he did have that dark complexion. But of course, his physical attributes and athletic ability probably transcended the race again. But some may argue that as well. I'm not going to stay with this too long, but let's just see. 2, don't politicize STEM. Stick to the science, not the social issues. Scientific research is influenced by societal values and priorities. Scientists are people, which means that their opinion, bias, and beliefs will be represented in the STEM workplaces. This makes science inherently political. In addition, many scientific studies deal with politicized subject matter due to the implications of their findings, i.e., climate science and COVID-19. Scientific findings that have direct and immediate societal health or safety implications frequently require the recruitment of political institutions out of ethical concern. The goal of activism in science is to use data backed from claims to support understanding, awareness, and actions in the public, political, and government spheres. This does not interfere with rigor of scientific claims. If scientists avoid communicating their far-reaching implications of their science for public health and safety in an effort to solely avoid politicization, this is an ethical and professional failing. It's interesting. It goes on deeper. This is by the journal journals.plos.org. I was going to PLOS, but yeah, that's what it is. I am not a racist. Number 3. I'm just going to cut off after this one. Let's see. If you do not experience systemic racism, you are likely benefiting from it, whether by being more generously supported by your institutions, being assumed to belong, or importantly, not bearing the significant mental and emotional burden of being subject to racism. Racism policies only exist because those in power benefit from the oppression of the minority groups. If you are benefiting from the oppression of others and choosing not to acknowledge and dismantle it, anti-black racism, dismantling, okay, there you go. Your compliance perpetuates the system. You cannot claim to be not racist and do nothing about it. Rather, we must be actively anti-racist and take steps to combat racism in our lives. Call to action. I would almost like to read the rest of this. Okay, let me read it. Now, I'll just read this one more paragraph. Many academics also need to bring anti-racism into their experimental design. A growing body of evidence suggests that culture, environment play a significant role in how individuals perceive themselves and their environments. However, the widely held belief that human behavior, perception, and memory are innate and should not differ across cultural groups can discourage scientists from collecting or considering data about culture and ethnicity as part of their research design. This often leads to non-representative studies that generalize the Western and education industrialized rich democratic experience to people from all cultures and ethnicities. Researchers across all fields that study human biology and behaviors have a key opportunity to experience being inclusive, anti-racist by designing representatives and robust studies. Interesting. So this is actually an interesting read. I'll put it in the communication of this podcast, and maybe you'll want to check it out and read it a little bit. As I said, it's from journals.plos.org. It's pretty interesting, actually. I do agree with some of what they have to say, but I just don't believe that you need to have it to make it the main focus of everything. If you've done nothing, you're a racist. If you benefit from not being whatever, by being in the predominant or the race, if you're a part of the race that is the dominating race in that society, that part of society or whatever, or that institution, you're benefiting. It's almost like a perk just being there. And therefore, if you're not actively fighting it and being an activist in your company and fighting against what's happening to this one and that one, or maybe you don't even know what's happening to this one and that one, but if you're not making it part of your fight daily, then it would suggest that you're a racist. Don't really agree with that, to tell you the truth. So let's see what John McWhorter argues, that anti-racism has become a religion of the left. Let's see. Now, this is written by Zaid Jilani. So I'm assuming he's going to get the words of John McWhorter in here, but let's see. Growing up in the 90s, I realized I was raised to be optimistic about our American society, or just American society. The society welcomed my parents from Pakistan with open arms. It produced the Georgia man who is in the days after 9/11 approaching my family and told us that if anyone harassed us in any way because of our Muslim faith, he would come to our aid. Okay. A new country still had problems. I decided to become a journalist so I could shed light on society's imperfections, but I did so in a spirit of hopefulness. In recent years, however, a much darker vision has emerged on the political left. America isn't a land of opportunity. It's barely changed since the days of Jim Crow. White universally privileged maintained an iron grip of American society, while non-whites are literally more than virtuous victims cast adrift on a plank in oceans of white supremacy. I don't believe that at all. I wanted to just keep reading this article. Hopefully it's going to switch at some point, but I can honestly tell you the experience of people from Pakistan, India, China, Sri Lanka, you name it, Middle East, people with different levels of lightness in their skin or kink in their hair, it does make a difference. There's some people that are even white passing from some of those cultures that I just spoke about just now. Let's see. This world view has swiftly implemented itself into major institutions, from our universities in our corporations. Why has it captivated so many people? The Columbia University linguist John McWhorter attempts to answer the question in Woke Racism, which seeks to both explain the rebut, whatever, this ideology. McWhorter and I both sit on the board of advisors of the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. McWhorter, who also writes the newsletter for the Times opinion section, is a black liberal who dissents from much of of the left's views on race issues in 2000. He published Losing the Race: Self-Sabotage in Black America, where he argues that corruption, cultural beliefs, and practices, not racial prejudice, were the main forces preventing more African Americans from succeeding. Some of his targets in the book were left-wing academics who he worried were helping transform victimhood from problems to being solved in an entity in itself. Yet, in the 2 decades since, Yet in the 2 decades since, those academics seem to have become more influential than ever. In his latest book, McWhorter suggests that because their ideologies has been elevated into religion, that's how he believes it. I do not mean that these people's ideologies is like a religion. I seek no rhetoric snap in this comparison. I mean that it actually is a religion, he writes. An anthropologist who sees no difference in type between Pentecostalism and this new form of anti-racism. While praising earlier generations of civil rights work, he objects to what he calls third wave anti-racism, which preaches that racism is baked into the structure of society's whites' complicity in living within constitutes racism itself, while for Black people, grappling with the racism surrounding them in total of experience them and must condition exquisite sensitivity towards them, including a suspension of standards and achievements and conduct. Borrowing a term from the author Joseph Bottom, McWhorter refers to the prophets of the third wave as the elect. They see themselves as bearers of good news that if all people would simply open up and see it, would create a perfect world. Well, that's not gonna happen. Interesting. I was hoping to read something that he wrote himself and not what somebody else wants to do as far as satire on his book. We'll have to move on from there. So let's see what Thomas Sowell has to say. Thomas Sowell says concepts of systemic racism has no meaning. Warns U.S. could reach point of no return. Let's see what he has to say. Hopefully this is written out properly. Okay, let's see. I'll just read it from the top. I don't know how long it's going to be. Oh, it's not very long at all, actually. Let's see. There are videos here in this. This is on foxnews.com. So I'm not really sure if they're going to censor this. But let's see. Economist and author Thomas Sowell told Life, Liberty, and Levin in an interview airing Sunday evening that the left's claim that America is beset by systemic racism has no definitive meaning and cannot be tested in an empirical manner. You hear this phrase, systemic racism or systemic oppression, host Mark Levine told Sowell. You hear it on our college campuses. You hear it from very wealthy and fabulously famous sports stars. What does that mean? And whatever it means, is it true? It really has no meaning. This is Sowell. It really has no meaning that can be specified and tested in the way that one tests hypothesis, answered Sowell, who added that currency of the phrase reminds him of the propaganda tactics of the Nazi Germany, where Sowell claimed that if a lie was repeated long enough and loud enough, it would be widely believed. I'm gonna have a coughing fit. Sowell agreed with Levin's theory that most of who have taken part in protests across America in recent months do not live in the communities that they claim to support, but only go there to hand out turkeys and Thanksgiving, like among the people they claim are oppressors. They are absolutely hypocrites, the host said. They claim they want equality for all. They claim that there'll be the withering away of the police departments. Yet every time you look at the Marxist states in an authoritarian, top-down, centralized police state, Seoul claimed in that while activists claim to be casting off racial and class differences, they only end up creating their own nomenclature and establishing their own hierarchies. If the election goes to Biden, he added, there's a good chance that Democrats will control Congress. Sorry. Sorry about that, everyone. Unfortunately, I'm just coughing down the place. Anyway, just to end what he was saying here, as I said, Seoul claimed in that while activists claim to be casting off racial and class differences, they only end up creating their own nomenclature and establishing their own hierarchies. If the election goes to Biden, he added, there's a good chance that the Democrats will control Congress, and considering that kinds of things they're proposing, that will be point of no return for this country. So we'll see, because he did win. Sorry guys, I don't know why I'm coughing like this. So I'm not sure how much you really gleaned from this, because I mean, the best thing would really to have these three gentlemen, including the one that I'm going to read right now, John McWhorter, Thomas Sowell, and say John MacArthur, speak for themselves and actually have their voices on here. But basically, none of them are agreeing with the anti-black racism movement as it is. None would deny that it's not in society. But they're not for it in the way that it is being put forward in society. And it would be interesting, those 10 common criticisms of anti-black racism and actions in it. All right, let's see. So let's see what John MacArthur has to say. Is the controversy over social justice really necessary? Well, sports fans, looks like I'm really going to struggle through this one, because, you know, when you have that tickle in your throat, yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I feel like I'm sitting on one of those public school buses or public transit, and I got a tickle in now. It's like I want to jump off the bus. Let's see if I can get through this podcast. I do not relish controversy, and I particularly dislike engagement in polemical battles with other evangelical Christians. Sorry, I'm past my time, I think, of reading. But as my previous post in the series demonstrates, when the gospel is under attack from within the visible church, such controversies is necessary. And if it seems fierce disagreement within the church have been the rule rather than the exception, that's because relentless attacks on the gospel from people professing fidelity to Christ have come in an unending parade since the very beginning of the church age. There has never been an extended period in church history when it has not been necessary for faithful voices to mount vigorous defense of one or more cardinal biblical principles. None of the controversies I've described in my previous posts sprang up suddenly. The lordship controversy, for example, was a conflict many of us saw coming more than a decade before I wrote the Gospel According to Jesus. The twisted gospel of the prosperity preachers has roots in the Pentecostal movement going back to the early 20th century. Normally, we can see storm clouds brewing and anticipate where the next major assault is coming from. But occasionally, a new threat to the simplicity or charity of the gospel seems to erupt with stunning force and suddenness. The current controversy is social justice, and racism is an example of that. 4 years ago, I would not have thought it possible for Bible-believing evangelicals to be divided over these issues of racism. And Christians, we stand together in our affirmation of second great commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19:18. We therefore stand together against every hint of racism or racial animus. Racism is a stain on American history that has left shame, injustice, and horrible violence in its wake. The institution of slavery and costly civil war left a deep racial divide and bred bitter resentment on every side. No sensible person would suggest that all vestiges of those evils were totally erased by the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. Civil rights legislation now guards the legal principles of equal rights for all Americans, but no law can change the heart of someone who is filled with prejudice or bitterness. Thankfully, however, much progress has been made. Racial relations in secular America are not what they were 15 years ago. American attitude has changed. White supremacy and all the expressions of purposeful, willful, and ideological racism are almost universally condemned. As a Christian, we know that the human heart is evil. So undoubtedly, there are still people who secretly harbor animosity against ethnicities other than their own. But any open expression of acrimony, ill will, or deliberate antagonism across ethnic lines will be scorned and emphatically rejected across the whole spectrum of mainstream America life today. American life, sorry. Of course, people everywhere still tend to be oblivious to our inconsiderate of customs, traditions, community values, and ethnic differences outside of their own culture. Culture clash is a universal problem, not uniquely American or Canadian quandary, and it's not necessarily an expression of ethnic hostility, but Americans' contempt for racial bigotry is now so acute that even accidental cultural or ethnic insensitivities is regularly met with the same resentment as blind, angry racism. So in other words, doesn't matter if you meant it or not, if it was an accident, we're going to get you. Cancel culture. And even a simple social gaffe is likely to be treated the same as bigotry. There are people, increasing numbers of them, so obsessed with this issue that they seem able to find proof of racism in practically everything that is said or done by anyone who doesn't share their worldview. I understand when fallen worldly people filled with resentment lash out at others that way. I don't, however, understand why Bible-believing Christians would take up that cause. And he goes on. In that, he reads that from his blog post at Grace to You, or at g2y.org. And that is an interesting read as well. Hopefully I'll link all these conversations. I'm sure I wasn't reading it the best, but let me just say one more thing, because he does say another scripture here from Galatians 5:22 to 5:23. We have the cross of Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit who grows and leads us all in love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. In the days to come, I want to discuss those answers. That's interesting. Okay, anyhow, that's where he's at with it. But as I was saying, some of these words like anti-black racism and systemic racism and equity and some of these things some of these statements seem so convoluted and cloudy, and for you to stand on one or the other side is a little bit difficult, especially if you're a Christian, because there's many things that both sides stand for that a Christian doesn't stand for. It's obvious growing up, as born in the 70s, growing up in the 80s, and basically married by the time the 90s came around, but still a young man. These things obviously affected me, But one thing I can tell you, the one way that they could help communities is to help the parents, help the people who have the gaps in their education that are teaching children or rearing children. This attitude of just moving on to the children and catching them young was like, well, what about all the damaged adults from some of these situations? What are you doing for them? Or not what are you doing for them, but how are you helping the things like what I referred to earlier, the stuff that happened to some of these people as young people that have caused them to be damaged adults. You can go in and try to be, coaches for the young black children, but they're still going home at night to these damaged black people or black adults. It's a whole community effort. And it shouldn't be that only some parts of society understand, but of course it is the world, and the world is a sinful place. And nobody's ever going to be 100% on board with everybody else's ideas. But anyway, this has to be left for another conversation, another time. And I'm going to sign off right now because I think I've probably overstayed my welcome. And we just hit an hour. So I would like to sign off, and I'd like to thank you for coming out again. This is MCM, and this has been You're Probably Right. And you know what? If you don't agree with my viewpoints, you know what? You're probably right. But maybe not. Anyhow, till next time, it's MCM signing off. Take care. Good day, good afternoon, good night. How you doing? This is MCM, and you're listening to You're Probably Right. Today, we are going to have a serious conversation. Well, maybe not a serious conversation, but there's going to be a serious talk happening here. Now, of course, I'm only doing the talking, but just stay tuned. Hey, come check out You're Probably Right podcast. Society is getting more unpredictable every day, but at the same time, predictable in its unpredictability. Say that 4 times real fast. Come with me as I attempt to find clarity in all the fog while staying way outside the box and kicking the box way down the road with my size 12 docs. I use the Bible, experience, education, fortune, misfortune, life's lessons, life's mistakes to sort through all the mess. I talk about news, God, God, self-help, sports, sickness, health, music, parenting, love, humbleness, hurt, pain, joy, and all the things that might make you say, I never thought of it that way. Hopefully, anyway. Also, I take a stab at answering tough and not so tough questions, and all the while understand that, listen, sometimes you end up in the hot seat and there's no thermostat. Well, that's how it is here. And because there's no topic, very few topics off the table, Torontonians will understand that Doug Ford reference there. Hopefully the podcast will be helpful and uplifting. And hey, maybe you'll find your own private Idaho here somewhere. Hope to see you soon.